Jason Arsnow here from Net at Work, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to reconcile Sage Intacct to Sage 300. Typically this would need to be done after a data migration from Sage 300 to Sage Intacct. You may or may not have a drop-down menu like this, but that's okay. We're going to run everything from the top level, so if you don't see this drop-down, you can just ignore it. I'm going to come over to my application menu over here. I'm going to come to the general ledger, and I'm going to come over to the dimension balances report. The environment that I'm in, the fiscal calendar follows the regular calendar. But if yours doesn't, Intacct has special reporting periods if we scroll down here, and you can use these instead. You could select something like current fiscal year. I'm going to run this for December 31st, 2020, and I can put 20 in and tab off, and Intacct will autocomplete, or I could type out the full year if I wanted. I'm going to scroll down and select all accounts. Under location, I'm going to select the entity that I'm reconciling. I have entity 300 right here, and I'm going to select that. Now down here, there's different options around dimensions and GL accounts that we want to show. So depending on what dimensions were configured during your Sage Intacct implementation, your options may differ here. For me, I'm going to select the account name, and I'm going to select the account ID. I'm also going to select the department and the department name. I'm going to drag and drop these in the order I want. And I'm selecting these separately so they'll show up in separate columns. So you can see there is a combination account ID and name and department ID and name. You can select those if you want. Just be aware that they're going to dump into the same column. And if you export to Excel, they're going to be combined. I'm going to press done, and then we'll go ahead and press run or view. All right, and here's the report. Now, what Intacct does is we'll take the value of each GL account, and then we'll break it down by whatever dimensions you've selected in the previous screen. If you find something is missing, you can press Customize, scroll back down to the Show Dimension Values, and you can select something else. So I'm going to select Class ID and Class Name. Press Done, press View again, press OK. You can see now Class is in its own column, and we can see the class name right next to it. I can also export this directly to CSV or Excel. All right, so that's all fine and dandy. Let's now log into Sage 300. And I'm going to come down to the general ledger here and general ledger reports, and I'm going to run trial balance. I'm going to select balances as of year/period. I'm going to select my year of 2020, and I'm actually going to select the adjustment period. Now, the standard conversion that we do is to put the adjustment period into the last period in Sage Intacct. So in Sage 300, any adjustments that were entered would come across as essentially a period 12 transaction inside of Intacct. We do have flexibility on how we can change these if we need to put them in a separate adjustment book or something like that. But we find that putting adjustments into the last period inside of Intacct suits most of our clients' needs. From here, I'm just going to go ahead and press print. And here's the report. Depending on how you defined your mapping table from Sage 300 to Intacct, you may have some consolidation or translation that happened. And in my example, all the accounts that start with 1 went to account 101000 inside of Intacct. So what I'll do is I'll come over to the last page. And we can see down here that there's some 9,000 accounts. I'm going to pull this to the side here. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom and get to my suspense account. Now I'm going to scroll over and you can see that I have this particular value over here. And I know in my translation table, I combined accounts 9,000 and 9999 together. So I'm going to pull up my trusty calculator. And I'm going to add my two 9,000 accounts together. You can see that when we add the values together, it reconciles with the single account that we map to inside of Intacct. So for our purposes today, I could say that this particular series of accounts has now been reconciled to the singular account that we consolidated to inside of Intacct. One other key difference is that inside of Sage 300, unless you tell the system to do this, it won't close out to the particular segments inside of inside the system. So if you have a department segment or maybe a line of business segment or something like that inside of Sage 300, typically you will point that to a single retained earnings account, and it won't be, dimensionalized. Inside of Intacct, it works a little bit different. So let's take a look at retained earnings, 3,200. Here's our retained earnings here. But you can see that retained earnings is repeated many times. That's because Intacct is breaking it apart by the dimensions that we've told it to. So we've told it to break everything apart by department and class in this example. And inside of Sage 300, we don't have that level of detail when it comes to the retained earnings account. Come up here, I'm going to right click on the tab and press duplicate. That's going to get me a brand new tab. And from here, I'm going to go over to the trial balance report. So I'm going to go to my application menu, general ledger. I'm going to scroll down till I find my trial balance. I'm going to put my date in of 12/31/20, tab off. I'm going to put in my location. That's the entity in which I'm reconciling. And I'm going to scroll down and let's go ahead and view. All right, let's take a look here. And when we look at retained earnings, you can see we get a single line for retained earnings here from the trial balance report. That's something different than what we get on the dimension balances report. So when we take a look at the retained earnings value, this is a debit balance. So that will show up in the debit column inside of Sage 300. Just also note that credits show it in their own column over here on Sage 300, but they'll show as negative values in a single column inside of Intacct. You may also notice that there is some opening balances here as well. What we're doing is it looks like we're running for the current month, and I'll press customize to go back to change the criteria for the trial balance report. But I want to point out there is a retain year-to-date balances, and that will pull through So refresh the opening balances for this column. So I'm going to go and check that checkbox off. Press View again. And you can see what it does, right? You can see that the income statements have now been removed and that the retained earnings value has essentially been updated. So there's a key difference between Sage 300 and Sage Intacct. Sage Intacct has what is referred to as a continual close. And that's what we're seeing with that checkbox, is that we're able to essentially flush everything out to retain earnings with the click of a box and rerun that report. So for the purposes of reconciliation, we're going to want to leave that report or that checkbox turned on, and that will give us insight into the balances of the income statements. Sometimes we may want to reconcile the closing period in Sage 300 to Intacct. So how we can do that is close this. I'm going to change the period to closing. Press print, run the report. And like I was mentioning, since Intacct has a continual close, there is no batch that gets created that closes out all the income statements to the retained earnings accounts. So what we have instead, again, is like a continual close. And in order to get the values from Sage Intacct, what we'll do is hit Customize over here. I'm going to go back to my Dimension Balances report. So General Ledger, All, Dimension Balances. And we're running this over here for the closing of 2020. What I'm going to do is run this report over here for January 1st of 2021. I'm going to select my all accounts, filter on my location, and I think everything else looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and press View. Click through the message. It warns you that it's going to take a while to run, but it never does. So I wanted to point out here that there is no closing period inside of Intacct, but there is something called an opening balance. And the opening balance for the year equals the closing balance in Sage 300 for the previous year. So again, opening balances for the year 2021 will equal the closing balances in Sage 300 for fiscal year 2020. And you would go about reconciling these in the same sort of way. And again, you would be using this column instead of this column. One other thing to note is that Sage 300 has an option to close out certain segments or GL accounts to particular retained earnings accounts. I just want to point out that if that configuration was set up at some point and then changed, after it was posted to, that can affect the retained earning balances and any sort of retained earnings adjustments done to those accounts. So I just wanted to mention that if there was a change in how retained earnings was closed out to inside of Sage 300, kind of midstream, that we will likely need to do some manual adjustments inside of Sage Intacct to get everything back into balance, just due to the nature of the two systems and how they close out to retained earnings in different ways. So I want to thank you for your time today. I hope you found this video useful or at least interesting. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Net at Work. Thank you so much.